right, good morning, everyone. My name's Danny Harvey. This presentation is on passive solar design. And as we know, the sun releases a lot of energy. A lot of that energy reaches our planet, and a lot of the energy that we use on our planet comes from the sun. Sun releases a lot of energy all the time in various types of electromagnetic radiation at a number of different high frequencies. Visible light is almost half of that energy output. The amount of that solar radiation that's reaching the outside of our Earth's atmosphere is given as 429.2 BTUs per square foot per hour. That's referred to as the solar constant. And that amount of energy is approximately 35,000 times our annual human energy use. So every hour, the surface of our planet is receiving nearly 35,000 times the amount of energy that we use every year. Now, a lot of that energy is reflected by our atmosphere. So nearly a third of that energy gets reflected back out into space, but about 70% of that energy reaches the Earth's surface, where it is either reflected again, transmitted, or absorbed into the surface. Once it's absorbed into the surface, it later radiates back out into the atmosphere. So we have a lot of energy transfer happening all the time from solar radiation. Passive solar design is a means of building that uses that solar radiation and captures and stores for reuse and transfers that energy through non-mechanical means. Active solar systems would be like a solar panel that is actively transferring that solar radiation into electricity. But passive solar design simply uses the energy that's reaching the surface of our planet all of the time. We've talked about a number of ways that heat is transferred. We've talked about radiant energy. Everything radiates energy. The sun radiates a lot of energy, and that energy reaches us through a void. There's nothing in space for that energy to transfer through, so it's not conducting or convecting through any material. So there's no medium that energy is transferring through. It's directly transmitted to us. Conduction is that energy transfer through a solid material, and all materials that have mass transfer energy at their given rate. Convection is an energy transfer through a fluid that includes gases and liquids, and passive solar design utilizes all of these methods of energy transfer. The amount of energy that we are receiving at any one time is affected by the path of the sun. The solar trajectory is something that varies across the surface of the planet, and it's going to be dependent on what latitude you are and at what tilt the planet is at any given point in the year. So that amount of energy that we're able to receive varies according to how directly we're receiving it. In the summer, you can look here, we've got direct overhead sun and it's coming straight down at us. We're receiving more of that direct heat energy. And in the winter, when the sun is lower on the horizon, the angle of incidence changes the amount of energy that gets reflected. So we receive a little less energy during that time. And that angle actually spreads the amount of energy over a greater surface area. So we don't receive as much energy in any one small area. So the amount of energy received per square foot changes. We can utilize that information in siting our buildings by knowing what latitude we are and what the angle of the sun will be at any time of the year, and orienting our buildings to collect as much of that radiant energy as possible in the winter and not collect that radiant energy in the summer when we want to be cool. The orientation of the house along the east-west axis, the longest dimension being on the southern side, increases the amount of exposure on that side of our building, allowing us to capture as much energy as possible in the winter when the sun is lower in the southern sky. Having a downward slope on the site may increase the amount of time that the sun is in direct exposure to the house. And then in times when we want to reduce the amount of solar heat gain, natural shading, things like trees, overhangs, or terrain changes can provide natural shading to areas of the house that we don't want to receive as much direct solar energy. And weather exposure. We have a lot of northern winds and other things that affect the energy use of the house, and we can site our house accordingly to reduce any unwanted impacts. Elements of the passive solar design can be used in any part of the world. Of course, if you're on the equator, your sun's going to stay directly above you at any time of the year. But anywhere else in the northern and southern hemisphere, if we orient the building toward the equator, then we're going to be receiving the most amount of sun in the colder months. We site the longest dimension of the house along the east-west axis to provide as much southern exposure as possible. Maximize the amount of glazing on the southern exposure, and I'll talk a little bit more about glazing as we go. Typically, you'd only want to use about 1/3 to 2/3 of the square footage on your southern exposure for glazing. It's possible to have too much glazing. So when I say maximize, I don't mean make the entire south side of your house a giant window. Minimize the eastern and western glazing to avoid your increased summer heat gain. In the summer, if you've got a large western window and that sun's beating in, it's going to be providing a lot of heating in that space in a time when you want to keep it cool. Shading your glazing in the summer, again, will reduce the amount of unwanted heat gain. And the core elements of passive solar design are storing that energy that the sun is providing in a thermal mass that allows it to be conducted in the space and to radiate into the space. And that helps regulate the temperature throughout the day by having it stored in a thermal mass. And then, of course, as with most green buildings and energy efficient buildings, we want to insulate and air seal sufficiently so that we're not losing our desired heat and we're not gaining undesired heat in the summer. Looking at the image above, it's a somewhat typical passive solar home plan in that we have a large amount of glazing here along the southern side. They actually have a sunroom here that's collecting some heat. There's a lot of glazing along this south area. And here on the west, this is all a sunroom with a porch. And they have interior windows as well that allow that solar radiation into the main space during the day. And these windows can be shaded when necessary. I'm going to talk a little bit more about those ideas as we go. There are two main types of passive solar design. The first is a direct gain passive solar, where the interior space is heated directly by the solar radiation. The sunlight coming into the home is captured and stored. We see that there's south-facing glazing. The windows allow that sunlight into the home. The solar radiation is transferred inside the space and then stored in a thermal mass that then slowly releases that energy throughout the day. And then having a good insulated building envelope allows that energy to be in the areas that we want it and not to escape where we don't. The other type of passive solar system is an indirect gain system, where the solar radiation is actually captured outside of the building. It heats a thermal mass outside the building, and then that heat energy is transferred into the interior, either through conduction or convection. You can see in this example here, we have a greenhouse that has a solar, acts as a solar collector here, where the solar energy is able to enter that external space, heat up a thermal mass, which then conducts to the inside, but then is also open to the air inside, and the hot air moves towards the cool air inside, and the cool air is then drawn out and through the space, creating a convective heat loop or a thermosiphoning action. I'll talk more about that as well. Two primary types of indirect gain storage systems are thermal storage walls. There are a number of different types of thermal storage walls, and roof ponds, which are a little less common and a little bit more complicated, but also very effective. Thermal storage walls absorb and store the radiant energy and then release that energy into the interior space. They tend to be constructed out of masonry, and they tend to be dark colored to absorb the most radiant energy possible. In this situation, you can see it's somewhat like the greenhouse idea, just in a smaller system where you have a glazing that is a short distance away from the thermal mass. The thermal mass collects solar radiation from the glazing. And in this situation, there's ventilation that allows that air in the space, once it's warmed, to transfer into the interior, heating that space. And as it moves in, it's also drawing cool air at the bottom. So it's providing some ventilation in that space as well through a convective heat transfer and somewhat of a loop being created. One of the most well-known examples of this is called the Traum wall. Here is the best picture I could find of that, and I apologize for the resolution, but it's a building that was built in France in the 60s. And these spaces here that look like windows are all actually thermal collectors, where there's a thermal mass behind a piece of glazing, and you can see that it's painted a very dark color. And that captures heat and then moves it into the interior through conduction. I talked about the vented assemblies. This is a vented assembly where there are pathways for air to move at the top and bottom of the wall. The radiant energy is stored in this thermal mass and is also it's conducting through the thermal mass and then radiating into the space, while the air in this area, go back one. The air here is heating and transferring in towards the cooler air. The cooler air is getting drawn into this area and creating this convective loop. In the unvented assembly, there's no air movement through that wall. The radiant energy is simply stored in the thermal mass, and as the thermal mass heats up, it then conducts into the interior and then radiates from that thermal mass into the interior over the course of time. And this is a generally far more measured amount of heat transfer. With the convective heat loop, you have a lot more heat in the middle of the day and the air moves more quickly. In an unvented assembly, that's your air movement inside is not being affected. You're simply conducting energy through the wall and then radiating it into the space. There's some examples of roof ponds. Some advantages of roof ponds are that they maximize the amount of surface area. It's often able to have more square footage on a roof surface than you are able to have on a wall surface. So you get a lot more surface area to collect radiant energy. And roof ponds are able to both heat and cool. In the summer, that's actually preventing some of that heat that would normally be hitting the roof and transferring through the roof into the building. It's slowing that heat transfer process a lot more than a typical roof assembly would. And that heat is stored and releases gradually. There are some direct transfer methods. You see here, we've got a pond directly on top of a building, and there are some indirect methods where you have storage tanks that use water as the thermal mass and then uses piping to move that energy to another area inside a building. So here are a number of examples of passive solar design in both a residential and a commercial space. This is a project I worked on in Atlanta that has a residential learning area and a commercial learning area. This is the South Face Energy Institute, and they started out as the Georgia Solar Energy Coalition. They've used both of these spaces to highlight a number of different types of passive solar design. You can see that there is a lot of glazing on the south side of the building. These are the south sides of the building. There's not a lot of glazing on the east and west sides of the building. And where there are windows on the western side, it uses a mechanical interior shading to prevent unwanted heat gain in the summer. There are a couple of interesting things happening here. You can see that there's a lot of shading for the south side of the building. And one of the ways that we're using shading here also is to allow indirect sunlight to transfer into the space by bouncing off the top of this shading. Another interesting design feature to me on this one is that these overhangs here were actually sized so that on the summer solstice, when the sun is highest in the sky, the shadow reaches to the bottom of these windows on the lower floor. So you're actually able to shade most of the windows during the points of the highest amount of heat gain. You can see a couple other solar ideas happening here. These are active systems. This is an active solar shingle. And then we've got some passive solar hot water I'll talk about also. All passive solar systems utilize thermal mass, and thermal mass is what we store the radiant solar energy in, how we transfer that energy into the space. Typically, walls are made out of high thermal mass materials like concrete, stone, and brick. Floors can be made of concrete, stone, or ceramic tile. Interior elements include cement plaster or masonry fireplaces that are oriented and sited in a way that they become thermal mass and are used to radiate that energy back into the space. And we talked about water with isolated storage and roof ponds. There are a number of other very high thermal mass and high R value insulations available. And the amount of energy that is transferred through that material, you can see here, is rated at heat capacity and thermal conduction. So something like the metal of the shipping containers that we just saw has a very high rate of conduction, and something like a brick wall or very dense concrete or a insulated concrete form that has concrete and a insulated material over that can have a very slow rate of thermal conduction. That allows that heat to be radiated out into the space at a much more regular rate. Talking about the glazing on your building, it's important to know what your solar heat gain coefficient is for your windows. The solar heat gain coefficient is the fraction of that radiation that is actually transmitted into the space. A lot of your radiation is going to be reflected off of the window. A lot of the radiation is going to be absorbed by the window, and only a fraction of that radiation is transferred into the interior. When you're designing for passive solar, you may want more energy transmitted into the interior than you would have in a typical window. You might want a very high solar heat gain coefficient so that you get a lot of energy that's transferring through that window. And on your east and west sides, you may want a window that's much different, that does not allow as much energy to transfer through the window. Something that's important to know with solar heat gain coefficient is that rates the entire assembly. So it's actually testing how much energy is being transferred through the entire window assembly, the casing, the frame, and taking that into account for how much energy is absorbed. Something you may see more in a commercial setting is shading coefficient. And the shading coefficient is rating the glass only. It's not looking at the transfer of energy through the window assembly. This might be important in areas where you might be fabricating the window yourself. It might be a type of window that's not available pre-manufactured. You might just be building a new window out of a piece of glass, but you want to be able to know exactly how much is transferring through that piece of glass. And like I mentioned, you may want to use different levels of heat gain coefficient in different areas of the house. Some parts of the home you may want to be getting a lot more energy through the window. And the way that the windows are rated for their insulation value is the U value. That's the inverse of the R value. We want to have a higher U value for your east and west facing glass that's going to have a lot more direct sunlight in the early morning and in the late evening. But then it's also something that's important to consider for your south facing windows, because as I said, if we have a third to 2/3 of our entire wall square footage made up by glazing, that's a large amount of area that has a very low insulation level. So if you did end up designing a house that was all windows on your south side, that entire side of the house may have an R rating of less than 4. And if you have one whole wall of your house that has only a R4, you're going to have a lot of heat transfer through that wall at times when you don't have the solar collection happening. So at night, when there's no sun coming through, you'd be losing a lot of heat through that. And in areas where you're going to have a lot of cooling loads, you could be transferring a lot more heat into the house during the summer than you would like. This is also one of the areas that you can run into a lot of high costs for passive solar design. The better the windows you want to use, the higher the cost is going to be for your project. And there are a lot of different types of glazing options out there. I've looked at a couple down here that are typical clear double glazing, or a double glazing with a coating, or a double glazing with a gas. And we've seen low E windows and argon filled windows that transfer heat at different rates. If you start getting into triple panes and insulation, you can really add a lot of cost to the project, but it does come out in the long run. If you design properly, based on the amount of energy that you're using, you can have some energy savings that pay off those windows in the long run. These insulation materials, there's many options for insulation material, and there are various areas that you may want to use different types of insulation. The framing techniques that you use in your walls will maximize the amount of insulation in the walls, and that can be very important in a passive design setting. Remember, if we're not heating the house actively, if we're trying to use just the energy from the sun, we don't want to lose the energy that we've gained from the sun quickly. So capturing it, storing it in the house, and not letting it escape quickly becomes very important. Air sealing improves your insulation performance. The less air that's moving through your building assembly, the less air that's moving through the insulation material, the better it's able to capture and store heat. And a high thermal mass material will release that heat much more regularly. You can see in this graph here, the dotted line represents a typically insulated wall with a low thermal mass. And you can see how that curve matches the temperature of the outside as it goes throughout the course of the day. But a high thermal mass wall will stay much higher than the lower troughs and not raise to the high temperatures that we see in the outside. So it's regulating that curve and making that heat transfer much more even. This picture here is an insulated concrete form. So when the concrete is poured into these forms, it is insulated on both sides. This is an expanded polystyrene insulation material. And that creates the density of concrete to hold that thermal energy, and also creates that insulation layer that keeps that energy from conducting to the outside quicker than we would like. From that previous picture of the South Base Energy Institute, that commercial side of the building was all insulated concrete forms. That was 4 stories of insulated concrete forms, which was an interesting thing to work with. I'll say that. The isolated solar systems are a type of indirect storage that we talked about, where the heat is actually captured outside the building and then moved into the interior. This diagram shows a panel. Again, it's a painted panel that's a dark color to absorb as much heat as possible. This panel is located outside the interior wall. It has glazing over it and is a solar collector, allowing the radiant energy to heat this panel. As the air in that panel is heated, it is moved up and into the house. And as that hot air enters the space, it's drawing cool air from the space back into the panel to again be heated and create that convective loop. And so passively moves air and heat into the space. In this situation, the example given for the thermal mass is this food to be dried, but this is a very common design that was used early on in passive solar for an external collector, where they would actually use masonry or stone in a box like this, and sunlight would heat that thermal mass, and as air is pulled in, it transfers through that thermal mass, and that heat is transferred to the air, and the warm air is then allowed to enter the space. That's something that you want to be able to control during the seasons. That sometimes you'll want to have that hot air coming into the house, and that sometimes you will not want to have hot air coming into the house. And I appreciated some examples like this. In this, the thermal mass is actually able to be a part of the external wall, and as that air is moving through the thermal mass and heating the thermal mass, it's also transferring directly, it's conducting into the space and radiating into the space in this type of a system. These isolated solar systems also include some hot water systems and some radiant floor systems, where the heat is stored and transferred into the inside of the house in different ways. There are a number of different types of heat storage. We talked about using a water, a masonry, or a concrete for direct heat gain. You can see in these situations where sunlight is able to hit the water and heat it up, or it's able to hit the stones and heat the stones, able to hit the concrete, and that heat is absorbed in that material and then slowly radiated into the space. That indirect gain is transferred from an external mass and then moved into the house. And in a solar radiant water, we have what is an evacuated tube system that has a liquid in these tubes. That liquid is heated, and then the hot liquid, the heat in the liquid, is transferred into the home. That can be used in some radiant floor systems, but is most common in the passive solar hot water systems. The passive solar hot water systems use a thermal collector to store and reuse that radiant heat. That is often a typical storage tank, a hot water tank, where as the water is heating up, it's being drawn into the hot water tank on a convective loop. The natural thermo siphoning occurs, and the hot water is moving in to the storage tank, and as the hot water moves in, it's replaced by cooler water from the storage tank, and that is a natural thermosiphoning loop that is happening without a mechanical means. It doesn't need a pump. It's naturally thermosiphoning. The different types of storage tanks can be used in different ways. These are external storage tanks, so that's all happening outside of the house. And then when we want hot water, we call on it, open up a tap, and the hot water from the tank is moved inside. Some indirect systems actually use the storage as a thermal mass inside the home, and that thermal mass then also radiates heat into the space. So that can be another type of indirect heat transfer and an indirect storage system. We're looking at our orientation, our design. It's important to think about what type of room is being, what type of use a room has, and where we're siting them. If you put all your bedrooms along the southern wall, but you're never in your bedroom during the day, it might be getting all of that heat and light, and you're not actually utilizing it. You want to utilize that natural illumination in the spaces that you're going to be using during that time of day. If you site the kitchen along the eastern and southeastern sides, you're going to get that morning sunlight when you're in the kitchen in the morning. You got your daylighting in your main openings in your larger common spaces during the day. That can reduce the amount of reliance on electric power for lighting. And with a lot of passive solar design, when we've got our house oriented to the south, then the areas on the northern sides don't receive as much sunlight, and we can use other means to get natural illumination there. These solar tubes allow radiant heat, radiant light to transfer into interior spaces that don't have external windows. And then a design that we've seen used a lot over the course of time, and not just recently, but for hundreds of years, is this idea of a clerestory window on the second story that allows light to enter all the way to the back of the home. So a couple of different ways that you can utilize a passive solar daylighting to get light to spaces that wouldn't otherwise have a direct solar path, and that can eliminate some of the energy use that you would normally have by having electric lights. The skylights and roof angle affect the amount of heat gain to the space. A lot of people really enjoy using skylights, and as I just talked about with natural daylighting, you might need to use some skylights to get light to some areas that wouldn't otherwise have them. If you've got a skylight on the northern roof, then it's not going to receive as much direct sunlight, except in the summer. And on the if you've got skylights on your southern roof, it's going to receive some really direct sunlight in the summer. So you may want to have some types of mechanical shading options. You may want to have a way to eliminate direct heat transfer when you don't want to have that direct heat transfer. You can see a roof like this that has a very shallow pitch and a lot of glazing. That's going to absorb a lot of direct solar radiation throughout the summer. So the cooling loads in this space would be pretty extreme. And the orientation, the angle of the roof could also greatly increase the amount of solar radiation that you're gaining in situations where you want to. So if you're in an area that you want to gain a lot of heat in the winter, and you're up in a northern latitude, you may want a very steep pitch to match the angle of the sun in the winter to gain as much light and heat as possible. So designing your roof angle correctly will, for your ideal situation can have a big effect. And it's important not to have too much glazing in a space and create a greater cooling load in the summer than you're gaining from the heat that you were gaining in the winter. You could be actually using more energy to try to cool the space if you design it improperly. I'm having a feeling I missed a slide. I may have skipped a slide, and I'll go back and look and see if I missed one here. But ventilation is designed. You can design a house to use passive ventilation, where the heat transfer, the radiant energy in the house actually encourages ventilation. Open floor plans that encourage ventilation, but then using natural stack effect and convection properties can encourage the natural ventilation, so that you don't need a mechanical fan or anything to actually move the air through the house. In these situations, you can see here we have what is like a chimney, and in this drawing, that's what this channel is right here. As the sun strikes that and heats that air up in that column, it is exhausted through the top and then pulls air in through the bottom to make up the air that is pulled through the space. And here we've got some vents that are pulling hot air out of the space and vents that are allowing cool air into the space. And so you can actually utilize that natural heat transfer to bring ventilation air into the space and avoid some of the cost of using a mechanical fan to move air through. I did miss one slide that I want to go back and find here. Yes, here's my shading slide for the glazing. It's extremely important to shade your glazing on your south face to avoid unwanted solar heat gain during the summer, so you don't have an increased cooling load. And there are a number of different ways to do that. You can see here on this commercial building, there's a small overhang that shades those windows when the sun is at its highest spot, but then allows the sun to hit the windows at times that we want to have that direct solar radiation. There are a number of different types of shades, awnings, screens, porches, natural shading like trees or trellises or vines that we can use on east and west faces to eliminate unwanted heat gain. And then something else that's interesting also is the angle of the windows and how that can be used to change the amount of direct heat gain that we have. In this situation, there's an overhang. If we had a vertical window, when the sun is at its highest point in the sky, it's going to be, the overhang will be completely shading the window. In this situation, they've actually angled the window out at the top so that the window itself would never be in direct exposure to the sunlight. And when the sun is lower in the sky, that angle is also diminished. So it's not actually going to be receiving as much direct energy as it could be, but it's reducing the cooling load. So if you're in a situation where you have far more cooling needs than heating needs, angle of the window can change the amount of heat that's entering through the window. And then conversely, if you want to heat more than cool and you want to accentuate as much heat as possible, you might angle the window the other way so that it's collecting as much heat as possible in a heating climate if you're trying to capture as much heat as possible. There's an example of that in my last slide here. You can see that those windows are angled to capture as much of that winter sun as possible. So in conclusion, a passive solar design is a very old way of using the natural heat that's available in our environment to heat our living spaces. We've talked before about Mesa Verde here, where there's a natural overhang that shades the buildings during the summer to keep them cool. And then as the sun is lower in the sky, direct sun is able to heat these walls, which are a adobe that are able to capture a lot of that thermal energy and then slowly radiate them back out. And in much of passive solar design, we are using a lot of these natural ideas and mimicking that type of environment. So we create these overhangs that are a lot like these natural overhangs and use a thermal mass that is a lot like these natural thermal masses. And by doing that, there can be a lot of upfront cost, in design, in material, in planning, and other considerations to make sure that you're getting the most efficient use of the space, the material, and the site, the other design elements, including your glazing and your ventilation. You can spend a lot up front. The cost can be very high, but then ideally, your monthly cost to heat that space or cool that space is far lower than it would be if you were using a combustion heat source or any other type of heat source. So over the long run, you can have an energy payoff where you've actually recouped the cost that you spend on this building. And it's a design that I think is going to be far more important in the future as we continue moving away from fossil fuels. And it's worthwhile to point out also that the reason that we got to where we are now was, as far as our building design and not using these type of ideas, is because of our reliance on fossil fuels and our ability to heat spaces with combustion, whether we're burning oil or coal or natural gas, and relying on the heat that we're generating from hydrocarbons instead of using the heat that's around us and naturally occurring and free. That is my conclusion. Here are my references. I highly recommend anybody take a look at especially Krieger and Dorsey's Residential Energy. And then as we're going on, I'm sure we'll end up talking about Joe Stiebrick's Builder's Guide for Mixed Climates. But a lot of my material here is from the 1979 Passive Solar Energy book from Ed Masria. And that just shows you how little some of this has changed even in the course of several decades. They're all very simple principles that are still in use today and remain unchanged because of how basically sound and correct they are. Thank you.
Wow, I vote you get 100 plus. Eric, you could teach a whole course on this by itself. You're muted.
There is a whole class on this.
Oh, it really is?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Questions?
Whew.
That's pretty thorough.
Well, this last slide here with the Adobes, are those window looking things, or those would those be the solar, what you call it?
Actually, no, in this situation, in this picture, this is just glazing. You can kind of see in through here. And actually, it's the same picture, same building as this. So that's the inside of the last picture you were seeing there, where those are the adobe walls. These windows are angled to capture as much of the direct sun exposure as possible in the winter, and then there's a thermal mass in the floor, thermal mass in the walls that collects and radiates that heat back to the space.
Well, that looks like a really nice room. I'd love to be there.
Yeah.
Also notice the
Is it not?
Say again, Sam?
Is it an earth chip?
This one is, it's bermed into the hill, yeah. I mean, it depends on your definition of earthship, but this one uses some, some grading to also encourage less conductive heat transfer through walls by having them in the, bermed into the earth.
Cool.
Also notice the vegetation in there, in that room.
Sure, yeah. And a lot of, my first experience with this sort of thing was an indirect system that was a greenhouse outside. And of course, in that situation, you also have to be very careful about your moisture transfer, because you end up with a lot of moisture in a greenhouse that you might not want to bring into the space. So if you're using an indirect system like a greenhouse, you might not want to use a vented system necessarily, or you might want to have other means of controlling moisture entering the space.
I'm gonna take over for just a second. So you talked about trajectory. Let me find it. Okay, so you talked about trajectory in the glazing. Maybe I can find it.
It's up towards the top there.
Okay,
Pull it
there we
down.
go. There we go. So, all right. So, question, and I know you'll know the answer, so I'm just picking on you a little bit. So, okay. So, as we know, here's our Earth, and actually, let's start again. Here's our Earth. No, let's try again. Here's our sun. I'll get it right in a minute. And we have our Earth here. We'll make Earth blue. And so our trajectory around the sun does kind of that. Now I'm exaggerating a little bit. So this is our winter. We're over here in winter. So why doesn't how come our winters are cold?
Because we're in the northern hemisphere and the axis of the planet is tilted away from the sun during our winter months, we have that indirect reflection. We've got a different angle of incidence on the surface of the Earth. So in situations where we're on the other side of our orbit and the northern hemisphere is tilted towards the sun, that energy is more directly focused towards any one spot. And so more energy is transferred directly at that spot. And when we're kind of tilted away from the sun, the angle of incidence is greater. And so we have less energy that is able to be transferred to any one small area. And I wish I had your bundle of straws, Eric, because if you take that bundle of straws and you put them all together, you can see that all of the points of those straws are going to hit in a small circle, and all of the points of those straws are going to hit that small circle. But if I angled all of those straws, then that circle becomes oblong and gets stretched out, and less of that energy is focused in the smaller area, and more of that energy gets dispersed over a broader area.
Very good. Very good. So our atmosphere plays, he was talking about, so the atmosphere being a problem here and where our latitude is, our orientation, the slope, and all of this. So that plays a huge, huge part of how much sunlight gets in. Obviously, when we're talking about those tropics, then the sun is overhead all the time, and we're getting, again, 100% of the sun. And so when we're up into, the northern and the southern hemispheres, then because of the way this tilt is, we're getting some of this deflection. Now, in Australia, when they're down here, they're getting more direct sunlight in the summertime, or their summer, our winter, their summer. So let's say summer here, and then so this is northern hemisphere, this is southern hemisphere, and then we have our summers, and then they have their winters. But because of the way the tilt is, even their winters are going to be warmer than our winters, and their summers are way warmer than our summers. While we're still on that notion of tilt, I want to applaud you, because you are probably the first person that has ever talked about the window tilt. And so this is huge. So let's think about something here for a second. So when we're talking about this window tilt, so we've got the wall coming in, and we've tilted our windows back a little bit. The sun's coming in. Notice that they're talking about the incident of angle here being tilted 78 degrees. And so why is that? You know, we've got this coming down through here and the 90 degrees coming off of there. And that's what they're talking about there, 70. I don't know why they point out 70. Is it 73, 78 degrees? I don't know why they point out 78, where this is what is super important. Anytime that you are less than 15 degrees, light cannot enter glass. Okay, so let's think about fiber optics. All right, so we have a clear fiber here, and we're going to shine light into the end of it because the end is 90 degrees. And what happens is that light is captured and cannot come out of there because it's less than 15 degrees until it gets to the very end, and then it can come out. And by tilting these windows, and I've only seen this in very, very few examples, by tilting this glass when the sun is high up in the sky there, then light cannot penetrate that window, or at least, you know, we have some visible light that we can see, but, you know, the UV rays and so forth are not going to be able to penetrate that, and they bounce off, and we don't have the heat gain there. So bravo on that. Another problem that seems to be an ongoing argument. I want to get your view on this. Low E windows. Low E stands for emissivity, which is the transfer of UV rays through glass. So the code actually says that south facing windows must be low E windows, and that's in the code. You have to do that. So arguments there have been, well, that takes away from our UV gain in the wintertime. What is your anything that you've come across there in the past or in your research?
I feel that it's probably okay to still continue to ask for those to be low emissivity, and that you can account for the difference in heat gain through adding glazing where you want to and where you can. Unless you're in a situation where you really just are trying to capture every single little bit of heat that you can, and not use any extra heat source. You know, if you're relying only on solar heat gain, I could see where you might have a bone to pick about having to use low emissivity. But otherwise, because of the way that the house is going to use energy throughout the times of the day when it's not indirect sunlight, and when you don't want to have heating, especially in mixed humid climates, I think it's perfectly fine to continue to use low E windows in those situations. And if you want to have more heat gain in any one area, that can be done through sizing of the glazing and not necessarily the type of glazing that you're using.
That's one of the things, you know, because you get these, and I'm for lack of a better word, I'm going to call them fanatics, where they're trying to, you know, they probably squeak when they walk because they're so tight. They're trying to get absolutely every little piece of blood out of that turnip. And so that, yeah, I agree 100% with you. And, you know, again, you can upsize your windows to get more glazing area there to overpower that emissivity there.
If you want to use a low E window, then it can be used on in an indirect system. You know, you can use a non-low E window. If you want to use a window that allows all of the UV gain possible, then use that on an exterior greenhouse system, or use that on an exterior indirect solar capture system where you're heating up another thermal mass and then transferring that energy inside. And then you're not losing any of that extra heat gain that you could be getting, but then you're not also bringing unwanted heat gain into the house or losing a lot of your heat because of a higher conductivity through the window assembly.
Right, right. Okay, I want to give you a real quick story right quick. I had a student who built one of these things here, and basically these what's good about these little heaters here is, and let me just find a picture right quick. So there's different types, but he built one very much like this. And the good thing about these are they can be taken out in the summertime. Okay, so you put them in the wintertime, you take them out in the summertime, and they work very effectively. If you ever build these, what's going on in here? You see this mesh absorber. So this is a heat absorber in here that's generally black. And I've had 2 students build 2 of these. One of them decided to use tar paper, builder's felt, in this thing. And the other one decided to use petroleum caulk. And I'll tell you what, guys, if you've ever, you ever talk about off-gassing, holy crap.
I was going to say, you don't want that in your house.
No, I mean, the builder's felt is nothing more than basically oil saturated or paper saturated oil, and I mean, and then that petroleum caulk, it stinks, it off gas like crazy.
Neither of those have the advantage of the mesh fabric, and the mesh is amplifying your surface area.
Yes.
Right? You want to have
Yes.
as much surface area as possible. The tar paper has a minimal amount of surface area.
Right.
I think the caulk.
Well, in the solar class, I gave them the option, and they didn't, this tar paper gets hot when, yes, it does. So, the student that at AB Tech, he built one, and I've actually got this in the classroom. So he put that metal mesh in there, but when he put it in, he had it exactly straight. So he's got an opening where he pulls air in. He's got an opening where air comes out, and this was to go up on a wall or something. Don't put it straight. Make that thing curve. So that way the air flows in and around that and pulls off the heat and gives it to the air. So in my solar technology class, we talked a lot, almost 100% on passive solar and so forth. So I had a student who at Western Piedmont at another school, and they had a greenhouse, and she wanted to try to get this greenhouse effectively able to sustain life in the wintertime. So she went in here and she painted this wall black, completely and totally black. Now this thing faced south, this is solar south. Then she come in and she put in a whole row of 55-gallon drums and put water in them. And then on the floor, she had a black EPDM put down so that it would also absorb. Well, it did. It did really great. It, on our coldest days in the 30s and so forth, this easily reached 70 degrees. No problem at all. The problem was in the summertime, it was getting really close to, super high temperatures, and you couldn't grow anything in here at all. So one of the things, and in passive solar, it is equally important in passive solar to have passive cooling. All right, so you've got to have this, especially in our climate, we've got to go both ways. So one thing that we done here is we removed the water in these things and we put sand in it and then poured water back into it. So what happened was we ended up with an evaporative system in here. We added some vents that could be opened up here towards the top so that air would circulate through. And that brought this temperature back down to to about 80 degrees. And that was anytime that the ambient air was lower than 80 degrees. Now, if the ambient temperature was above 80 degrees, it was generally whatever the ambient temperature was, but we were able to get it below 110 on that. So don't, when you're doing any kind of passive anything, don't overkill at all. Any other questions?
On that idea you just demonstrated, was that a brick wall or a
No, it's wood wall.
wood wall?
Yeah, it was T111.
Okay, would it have been possible to install like pull down reflective shades in the summer to reflect?
Oh, yeah. That was something else. Sorry. Thank you. So there are big shade mats that you put over greenhouses, that's kind of like it's a net that just kind of helps shade. We use these, you can use these, you can put them over the greenhouses, and you can also put them over chicken coops to keep animals, owls, hawks, and so forth from swooping in and grabbing your chickens and taking off. So the one thing that, and I don't know why it is, these are black. So even though, they're a great big net that's shading this, they would be more, they would do a better job if they were white or even, metal or something. I don't know, but white is going to reflect more of the light and not absorb anything in it. So,
Yeah, I was thinking along the lines of, like a silver shade. I remember growing up in the 60s, we had shades and curtains, but they didn't have a lot of colors. I think they had green, but I guess can you get any color you want or not?
I don't know. I have no clue. This is probably the coolest little thing that you'll ever see in passive solar. This is a solar wood kiln. So if you're going to be cutting any of your wood, that it has to be kiln dry. If we just leave it out here like that, the best that we can get in Western North Carolina is about 19%. But by putting into a solar kiln such as this, then we've got some fans in here. You can design this. Actually, Dennis Scanlon from ASU made a really nice design, much similar to this, where you have natural air outlets here that actually help circulate the air in here without the use of any kind of fan. You could put a DC fan in there with a PV such as this one. So if sun hits the PV, then it's going to be gaining energy here, and then it's going to turn a fan on, excuse me, to keep air going through there. So it's, these are really cool. And so you can do solar food dehydrators. Danny mentioned that a little bit. And so these can easily be homemade. And, this is the type that I'm usually accustomed to, which is much like the window unit that I was talking about. So you basically stack your food inside this little chimney here and on screens so that air flows through here naturally. Going back to that presentation, I want to actually bring up another thing. This chimney effect here. This is it's another rarity. You don't see it very often, but it is probably one of the smartest things that you could probably do. We've talked about, the ground being into the 50s, pulling hot air down in through this pipe, through here and into the house by a natural effect here. So chimneys don't always have to be for fireplaces. We can use chimneys, to help pull air into the house, fresh air into the house. And in this fashion here, then my concern is condensation in this tube here, because at some point, again, with that the psychometric chart, 95-degree air in Western North Carolina is generally about 80-90% humidity, and when we pull it into a cool environment, then we're going to end up having cool or have water condensate in here.
In any mixed humid climate, it's I feel it's really important to address that moisture before it enters your space. We've talked about
Yep.
ERVs and HRVs up until that. You know, there are a number of reasons to add ventilation in any situation, and so many of them don't take into account the moisture that you're bringing into the house. So
Absolutely.
particularly in what, you know, we live in a rainforest.
Yeah, exactly. We
It's
did.
going to be really important to control that moisture. So yeah, just having a pipe that moves through the ground and then enters the house, you're not going to want that system. You're going to want to be able to filter it to keep out external pollutants, but then you're also going to want to be able to deal with the moisture that's coming in with that as well.
Mm-hmm.
And something to point out also about that is that stack effect happens without the sun, right? It's not relying on the sun for that stack effect. We're just creating a pressure difference by having a chimney that is higher than the bottom of the house. So our natural pressure differences are going to create that air movement. It's not necessarily relying on the sun, but this example down in the bottom right corner, that's, you know, using both of those systems where you've got the sun heating up that space to also encourage greater energy transfer, greater air transfer. But that will happen all night long, regardless of whether the sun is on it or not, just because of the pressure difference created by the height.
Right. Yeah. You know, if you've got a chimney in your house right now and you don't have a fire in it, you can feel a draft going through that thing. And that happens summer, winter, spring, fall. And that's why we put a damper on it. So we close the damper, we kind of seal that off so that we don't have, and the chimney can work in an opposite effect too. When cold air sinks to the ground, it can come down this chimney, so you can have a backdraft through there. And that's why sometimes you can have problems in really, really cold weather if the chimney is not built correctly. In other words, if it's just a great, you know, a plain old solid shaft up through there, cold air will actually backdraft down through there and blow the smoke into the house. And that's I've seen that happen several times, just because a smoke shelf or the throat of it is not been put in place. And that's what that throat is for, is to help prevent that backdraft through there.
And we have reverse induction in this climate also.
Yeah, right. Any other questions?
This might be a silly one. Those rooftop ponds. You said something about those.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's a lot of issues with that sort of system, right? You gotta be very careful about that system. You know?
Wouldn't it grow algae?
Sure.
Well, I was
yeah,
going to
you
ask, are those safe to
have to
swim
keep it clean, just like a pool, I'm sure. You don't want to have that leaking into your house.
Obviously.
And then you're going to have to deal with some moisture. But what was your question specifically, Kobe?
I was going to ask if you could swim in those.
Yeah, why not, man? Make yourself a rooftop swimming pool and go swim.
I mean, I know I've seen a lot of those in like large commercial buildings, or maybe on like, I know
Vegas.
some New York City have those, or some bigger cities.
Yeah, typically these are
Long
actually
water.
far more shallow than a swimming pool.
Right.
You know, if it's 6 feet deep, then that energy that's hitting the top of the pool is not transferring very quickly to the bottom of the pool. You know, and you know, you're not going to get as much of a thermal advantage out of a 6 foot pool on your roof, and you're going to end up, you know, using far more power to keep your pool circulating and clean than you'd ever be saving by transferring any thermal energy into the house. So,
And don't even get started on the structure to hold all that 6 foot of water, you know.
yeah, exactly. There might be some embodied energy in that steel frame you're going to need.
Or in the winter, if it gets too cold, the water can freeze, obviously, right?
Yep.